The stagecoach door swung open, and Clara Whitmore's heart sank like a stone in deep water. The man standing before her was nothing like the refined banker whose letters had promised her a new life. He was dusty, scarred, wearing a gun belt slung low on his hips, and looking at her like she was something the cat dragged in. "You must be the mail-order bride," he drawled, his steel gray eyes taking in her silk dress with something between amusement and contempt. "Well, ma'am, I got bad news. Your gentleman's been dead 3 months. Welcome to my story. Stay with me until the very end, and please drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these tales travel." The Wyoming wind hit Clara's face like a slap, carrying the scent of dust and sagebrush. It was nothing like Boston, nothing like the neat cobblestone streets and gas-lit parlors where she had spent 23 years learning to pour tea and embroider pillowcases she would never use. Here the sky stretched endlessly in every direction. So vast it made her dizzy, she smoothed down her traveling dress, sky blue silk with mother-of-pearl buttons that had cost nearly a month's wages. The fabric was already filmed with trail dust despite her best efforts. Her hands trembled as she adjusted her hat with its ridiculous ostrich feathers that now seemed absurd under this merciless sun. "Miss Whitmore?" The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man named Polk, set her trunk down with a heavy thud. "You sure about this?" Clara lifted her chin, forcing confidence into her voice. "Quite sure, Mr. Polk. Mr. Harrison is expecting me." Polk's weathered face creased with what might have been pity. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then seemed to think better of it. "Well then, good luck to you, miss." The stagecoach pulled away in a cloud of dust, leaving Clara standing alone on what passed for a main street. The town of Broken Creek consisted of perhaps a dozen buildings scattered along both sides of a rutted dirt road. A general store, a saloon already emanating the sour smell of whiskey at 3 in the afternoon, a blacksmith shop where the clang of hammer on anvil rang out in steady rhythm. Clara scanned the sparse crowd for a familiar face, though of course there could be no familiar faces here. She was looking for the man whose photograph she had carried across half a continent. James Harrison, banker and landowner, whose letters had painted a picture of civilized life in the West. "You're looking for someone, ma'am?" Clara turned toward the voice and found herself facing a woman of perhaps 40, her face lined by sun and hard work, but kind. She wore a simple calico dress and an apron. "Yes, I'm looking for Mr. James Harrison. I'm Clara Whitmore. He should be expecting me." The woman's expression shifted, sympathy flooding her features. "Oh, honey, you're the mail-order bride." The phrase stung, though Clara had known that's what she was. "I'm Mrs. Eleanor Price. I run the boarding house. Dear, I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Mr. Harrison passed on about 3 months back. Fever took him, sudden-like." The world seemed to tilt sideways. "Dead? But I received a letter from him just 6 weeks ago." "That must have been one of his last letters," Mrs. Price said gently. "The mail is awful slow out here. I'm so sorry you came all this way only to find—" "Move aside, Eleanor." The voice was deep and rough-edged, coming from directly behind Clara. She spun around and found herself looking up into the face of a man who seemed carved from the same unforgiving landscape that surrounded them. He stood well over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and lean-hipped, in the way of men who made their living through hard physical labor. His skin was tanned dark by the sun, with weathered creases around his eyes. Dark hair, nearly black, curled slightly where it touched his collar. A growth of stubble shadowed his jaw. His clothes, dusty denim pants, a worn chambray shirt, scuffed boots with spurs and that gun belt, marked him as exactly what he was, a working cowboy. But it was his eyes that held her. Gray as a winter storm, assessing her with an intensity that made her acutely aware of every ridiculous detail of her appearance. "You must be Clara Whitmore," he said, though it sounded more like an accusation than a greeting. "James's mail-order bride." Clara drew herself up to her full height, which still left her having to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "I am Miss Whitmore, yes, and you are?" "Rhett Callahan, James's half-brother. I run the ranch now." "Then you received my telegram? You knew I was arriving today?" Something flickered across Rhett's face. "Didn't get any telegram. I'm in town for supplies." His eyes swept over her again. You planning to stay at Eleanor's boarding house while you arrange passage back east? The presumption in his tone ignited something in Clara's chest. She had spent the past year scraping together every penny for this journey. She had survived the death of her parents, the loss of her home, the betrayal of men her father had trusted. She had crossed half a continent alone. She was not about to be dismissed by a dusty cowboy. Actually, Mr. Callahan, I was planning to honor my commitment to your late brother. James and I had an arrangement. I traveled here in good faith, at considerable personal expense. Surely something can be salvaged from this situation. Rhett's eyebrows rose. Salvaged? Ma'am, I don't know what my brother promised you, but I'm not in the market for a wife, especially not some Boston socialite who'd probably faint at the sight of a branding iron. Heat flooded Clara's cheeks. Around them, several townspeople had stopped to watch. I am not asking you to marry me, Mr. Callahan, she said, keeping her voice level. But your brother made certain promises. He sent money for my passage. He committed to providing me with a home and security. I have no family to return to, and I spent my last dollars on the journey here. So perhaps you could show a modicum of decency and not leave me stranded. For a long moment, Rhett just stared at her. Then he exhaled sharply through his nose. James sent you money? Yes, $40 for travel expenses. Rhett's jaw tightened. That explains where the ranch operating funds went. He glanced at Mrs. Price. Eleanor, Miss Whitmore can stay at your place tonight. I'll cover the cost. Tomorrow I'll figure out what to do with Hirscher. I am not a piece of luggage to be dealt with, Clara said sharply. Could have fooled me, seeing as how you let yourself be shipped west like a mail-order package. Rhett turned to leave, then paused. Stay in town, Miss Whitmore. The ranch is no place for someone like you. He walked away before Clara could formulate a response, his spurs jingling with each step. She stood frozen, aware of the pitying glances from onlookers. Mrs. Price touched her arm. Come on, dear. Let's get you settled. Things always look better after a hot meal and a good night's rest. But as Clara followed the older woman toward the boarding house, her small trunk bumping along behind them, she wasn't sure anything could make this situation look better. She was stranded in Wyoming territory with no money, no prospects, and no way home. She had never felt more alone in her life. The boarding house room was small but clean. A narrow bed covered in a faded quilt, a washstand with a chipped basin, a single window looking out over the town's main street. Clara sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to cry. Then she washed her face and went downstairs to supper. The dining room held a long table where Mrs. Price served meals to her permanent boarders, a railroad surveyor, 2 prospectors, and an elderly man whose mind wasn't quite what it was. They all stared at Clara when she entered, but Mrs. Price's sharp look quelled any questions. The food was simple but well prepared. Beef stew with fresh bread. Clara ate mechanically, tasting nothing, her mind circling around her predicament. She had perhaps $3 left to her name. Even if she could find work in this tiny settlement, it wouldn't be enough to save for passage back to Boston. And what would she return to anyway? She had no family, no home. The friends of her girlhood had drifted away when her father's scandal broke, unwilling to associate with the daughter of a ruined man. Miss Whitmore, Mrs. Price appeared at her elbow. There's someone here to see you. Clara's heart jumped. She rose and followed Mrs. Price to the front parlor, where Rhett Callahan stood examining a needlepoint sampler on the wall. He had cleaned up since their earlier encounter, washed the trail dust from his face and hands, changed into a fresh shirt. Mr. Callahan, she said coolly, I wasn't expecting to see you again today. He turned, and something in his expression had shifted. He still didn't look pleased, but the outright hostility had muted into something more like reluctant obligation. I've been thinking about your situation, he said without preamble. It's not right what happened to you. James made promises, and even if he's gone, those promises shouldn't just disappear. Clara waited, afraid to hope. Rhett pulled off his hat, turned it in his hands. The ranch house is a mess, has been since James took sick. I've been too busy with the cattle to do more than keep the worst of the dirt at bay. I could use help getting the place in order. You're offering me work? Temporary work as a housekeeper. I can pay you $30 a month plus room and board. That should be enough for you to save up passage back east in a few months if you're careful. He met her eyes squarely. I want to be clear. This isn't charity, and it's not a courtship. I need help, and you need money. It's a fair exchange, nothing more. Pride warred with practicality in Clara's chest. She didn't want to be beholden to this rough man who had made his disdain so clear. But she also didn't have any better options. What would my duties entail exactly? Cooking, cleaning, laundry. I've got 4 ranch hands who come by for meals. The house needs a thorough cleaning, hasn't been properly done in months. My mother was Lakota, he added, as if this explained something. James was legitimate, I wasn't. He came west with romantic ideas about ranching. I've been working ranches since I was 14. Clara considered. $30 a month was more than she had earned at the boarding house in Boston, and it was honest work. I'll need Sundays off, she said, for rest and attending church services. Fine, we don't work Sundays except for essential stock care anyway. And I'll need proper supplies, cleaning materials, cooking ingredients, whatever is necessary to do the job properly. I'll take you to the general store before we head out. You can get whatever you need within reason. Clara extended her hand. Then we have an agreement, Mr. Callahan. Temporary employment as your housekeeper. $30 monthly plus room and board until I've saved sufficient funds to return to Boston. Rhett looked at her outstretched hand for a moment, then shook it. His palm was calloused, his grip firm but careful. We leave at first light. Ranch is about an hour's ride from town. I'll bring a wagon for you and your trunk. I'll be ready. He nodded and turned to leave, then paused at the door. Fair warning, Miss Whitmore. Ranch life is hard. It's not like anything you're used to back east. If you can't handle it, best to know now. Clara lifted her chin. I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Callahan. His mouth quirked, not quite a smile. We'll see. Clara barely slept that night. She lay in the narrow bed, listening to unfamiliar sounds. The wind rattling the window pane. The distant howl of what she desperately hoped wasn't a wolf, the creak of floorboards. Her mind raced with questions and worries. What if she truly couldn't handle ranch life? What if Rhett's ranch hands were rough or disrespectful? But what choice did she have? The only alternative was to throw herself on the charity of strangers, hoping to find work that might not exist. No, she had made her decision. She would keep house for Rhett Callahan, save her money, and return to Boston with enough funds to start fresh. When gray light finally crept through the window, Clara rose and dressed in her most practical outfit, a simple brown traveling suit and sturdy boots. She packed her trunk carefully, setting aside her finer dresses. She had a feeling they would be useless at a cattle ranch. Rhett was waiting when she came downstairs, standing beside a wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. He wore the same type of clothes as yesterday, but had added a leather vest and a wide-brimmed hat. A rifle rested in a scabbard attached to the wagon seat. Mornin', he said, taking her trunk and loading it with ease. You eat yet? Mrs. Price provided breakfast. Good. It's an hour to the ranch. They stopped at the general store first. For 20 minutes, Clara moved through the cramped space selecting items. Lye soap, scrub brushes, vinegar, flour, sugar, salt, coffee, cornmeal. She was acutely aware of Rhett watching her choices. You'll need more than that, Rhett said when she presented her modest selection. There's 4 ranch hands to feed, plus yourself and me. Get what you need to do the job right. With his permission, Clara added cured ham, dried fruit, canned vegetables, and various herbs and spices. By the time they were finished, the wagon bed held several crates. Put it on my account, Jessup, Rhett said to the proprietor. As they pulled away from town, Clara turned for one last look at Broken Creek. It wasn't much, but it represented civilization. She was leaving even that small comfort behind now. You afraid? Rhett's voice broke into her thoughts. Clara considered lying, then decided honesty was better. Yes, but I've been afraid before. It doesn't stop me from doing what needs to be done. He glanced at her, something shifting in his expression. What happened to you back east? My father died 2 years ago. He was a businessman. His partner embezzled everything and disappeared. My father couldn't bear the shame. My mother had passed several years before. I had no siblings, no close family. I worked at a boarding house, but the wages were barely enough to survive. When James's letters came, they seemed like an answer to prayer. James was kind, Rhett said quietly, educated. He loved books. Our mother was a school teacher. His mother, I should say. Mine was Lakota. My father married her after James's mother died, but it wasn't legal in the eyes of the law. There was no bitterness in his voice, just statement of fact. They rode in silence for a while. The landscape around them was unlike anything Clara had seen before. Rolling grasslands stretching to distant mountains, the earth alive with color, dotted with purple wildflowers she couldn't name. There, Rhett said, pointing. That's Callahan land. Clara saw a valley spread out before them, a silver thread of creek running through it. In the distance she could make out buildings, a house, a barn, several smaller structures. As they drew closer, Clara's first thought was that the ranch looked lonely. The house was 2 stories, built of weathered wood that showed more gray than white. The porch sagged slightly, several shutters hung at odd angles. 3 men emerged from the barn as the wagon approached. They stopped and stared. "Boys, this is Miss Whitmore," Red announced. "She's going to be keeping house for us. You'll treat her with respect or you'll find yourselves looking for work elsewhere. Clear?" "Yes, sir," they chorused, removing their hats. "Miss Whitmore, this is Tommy, Jake, and Miguel." Tommy was blonde and freckled. Jake was tall and quiet. Miguel was dark-haired and handsome with a charming smile. "Pleasure to meet you, ma'am," Miguel said. Rhett carried Clara's trunk while she followed him up the porch steps. The inside of the house confirmed her worst fears. It was filthy. Dust covered every surface. Dishes were piled in a basin. The floor was tracked with mud. Cobwebs draped the corners. Red had the grace to look embarrassed. "Like I said, it's been a while." Clara set down her handbag and surveyed the disaster. Part of her wanted to turn around and march straight back to town, but a larger part saw this as a challenge. "I'll need hot water," she said. "Lots of it. And I assume there's a stove that works?" "In the kitchen. There's a pump out back for water." "Then I suggest you show me my room so I can change into work clothes. This is going to take more than one day." For the first time since they had met, Rhett smiled, a real smile that transformed his severe face. "Yes, ma'am." Clara's room was small but clean, the best room in the house by far. A simple bed, a dresser, a washstand. The window looked out over the valley. After Rhett left, Clara stood there for a moment, looking out at the ranch that was to be her temporary home. She told Rhett she was stronger than she looked. Now she had to prove it. Clara changed into her oldest dress, tied her hair back with a kerchief, and rolled up her sleeves. Then she went downstairs and got to work. By the time Rhett and the hands came in for lunch, she had cleared the dishes, scrubbed the kitchen table until the wood showed through, swept the floors, and started heating water for washing. She had also found bread, cheese, and dried meat to make sandwiches. The men filed in, tracking fresh mud that made Clara bite back a groan. But they removed their hats and waited politely to be served. "This is real good, Miss Clara," Tommy said around a mouthful. "We ain't had fresh bread in weeks." "I didn't make the bread," Clara admitted. "I purchased it at the store, but I plan to bake tomorrow once I've gotten the kitchen organized." "You know how to bake?" Jake asked, his voice surprisingly soft. "I do. My mother taught me. I'm no professional, but I can manage basic breads and pastries." "Pastries?" Miguel's eyes lit up. "Like pie?" "If you can get me fresh fruit, certainly." "There is wild berries down by the creek," Tommy offered. "I could pick some after we finish with the fence." "That would be wonderful, thank you." Rhett had been quiet through this exchange, but Clara felt his eyes on her. When she glanced his way, he was watching with an unreadable expression. After lunch, the men returned to work, and Clara continued her assault on the house. She scrubbed floors until her hands were raw. She beat rugs until dust clouds made her cough. She washed windows until her arms ached. She organized the kitchen, throwing away items beyond saving. By the time the sun began to set, she was exhausted and filthy, but the kitchen was clean, the main room was presentable, and she had made a significant dent in the laundry. The men came in for supper, beef stew she had simmering all afternoon, cornbread, and berry pie. Tommy had made possible by bringing her a hatful of wild blackberries. "Miss Clara, this is the best meal we've had in months," Miguel declared. "Maybe years." "It's just stew," Clara said, though she was pleased. "It's stew with vegetables that ain't burned," Jake pointed out. "And pie?" When's the last time we had pie? They fell on the food like starving men. Clara noticed Rhett eating more slowly, but with evident appreciation. After supper, she shooed them all out so she could clean up. Her hands were shaking with fatigue as she washed the dishes. When Rhett appeared in the doorway, she nearly dropped the plate she was holding. "You should rest," he said. "You've done enough for one day." "I'm almost finished." "Clara," it was the first time he had used her given name. "You're dead on your feet. The dishes can wait until morning." Pride demanded she finish, but her body overruled. She was so tired she could barely see straight. Very well. But when she took a step, her legs buckled. Rhett crossed the room in 2 strides and caught her before she fell. "Easy," he said, his arm around her waist. "I've got you." For a moment they stood there, Clara acutely aware of how close he was. The heat of his body, the strength in the arms supporting her. She could smell leather and horses and something clean like soap. Then she regained her balance and stepped back quickly. "Thank you, I'm fine. Just tired." "You worked too hard." "I worked as hard as necessary." Something flickered in his eyes. Respect, maybe. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we can work out a more reasonable schedule." Clara climbed the stairs to her room, each step an effort. She barely had energy to wash her face before she collapsed onto the bed, not even bothering to undress properly. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was that she had survived her first day at Callahan Ranch. Tomorrow she would do it again. The next 2 weeks fell into a pattern. Clara rose before dawn to start breakfast. Coffee, eggs, biscuits, bacon. The men ate quickly and headed out to work. Then she spent her days battling the house into submission, one room at a time. She discovered that ranch work was governed by the seasons and the needs of the animals. The men were up before sunrise and often didn't return until after sunset. It was a brutal, unrelenting labor. But Clara's work was equally demanding. Cooking for 6 people, 3 meals a day, laundry, mountains of it, all done by hand. Cleaning floors tracked with mud after every rain. Mending clothes torn by barbed wire. Managing supplies, planning meals, fighting a constant battle against dust that seemed to regenerate overnight. Her hands, once soft and smooth, became red and rough despite the salve she rubbed into them each night. Her back ached constantly. She fell into bed each evening too exhausted to think. But slowly the house transformed. The floors gleamed, the windows sparkled. Fresh curtains hung in the main room. The kitchen became her domain, organized and efficient. The ranch hands noticed. "Miss Clara, this place actually feels like a home now," Tommy said one evening, looking around with wonder. They had become comfortable around her. Tommy, she learned, was an orphan who had been working ranches since he was 12. Jake was running from a troubled past in Texas that he didn't discuss. Miguel's family had a small farm on the other side of the territory, but he had come to learn the cattle business. They treated her with unfailing respect, helping her haul water without being asked, bringing her wildflowers, carefully wiping their boots before entering. Rhett was more difficult to read. He was gone most days, working alongside his men or riding out to check on the herd. When he was at the house, he was polite but distant. Sometimes Clara would look up to find him watching her with that same unreadable expression. They spoke little beyond practicalities, but they didn't have actual conversations, not like she had with James in his letters. She told herself it didn't matter. This was temporary employment. She was saving money. In a few months, she would have enough to return to Boston and start over. But on her third Sunday at the ranch, everything changed. Clara had walked to town for church services an hour each way, but she welcomed the exercise and the chance to see other people. Mrs. Price had invited her to lunch, and Clara had enjoyed the rare pleasure of a meal she hadn't cooked herself. She was walking back to the ranch in the late afternoon when she heard it, a sound like someone crying coming from the tall grass beside the trail. Clara stopped, listening. There it was again. She stepped off the trail, pushing through the grass. A young cowboy, younger than Tommy, maybe 17, lay in the grass, his face gray with pain. His leg was swollen to twice its normal size, with 2 distinct puncture wounds visible through his torn pants. "Rattlesnake," he gasped. "Got me about an hour ago. I was trying to walk to town, but—" Clara's mind raced. She had read about snake bites. The venom needed to be slowed. The victim kept calm. Medical help summoned quickly. What's your name? She asked, dropping to her knees. Charlie. Charlie Morrison. I work for the Jensen spread. All right, Charlie. I'm going to help you, but I need you to stay very still. Moving makes the venom spread faster. She yanked off her petticoat and tore it into strips, binding his leg tightly above the bite to slow the venom's movement. Then she fashioned a sling from her shawl to immobilize the leg. I'm going to get help, she said. Don't try to move. Don't leave me, he pleaded, fear naked in his young face. I won't be long, I promise. Clara ran. She picked up her skirts and ran faster than she had ever run in her life, her lungs burning, her heart hammering. The ranch came into view, and she screamed for help. Rhett appeared from the barn, took one look at her face, and sprinted toward her. Snake bite, she gasped. Young man on the trail, Charlie Morrison, an hour ago. I bound it, but he needs a doctor. Rhett didn't waste time with questions. He shouted for Miguel to saddle 2 horses, then turned to Clara. Can you ride? Yes, I learned as a girl. Then you're coming with me. We'll need to carry him back. Minutes later, they were galloping back down the trail, Clara clinging to the horse's mane, terrified but determined. When they reached Charlie, Rhett dismounted in one smooth motion and assessed the situation. Good work with the binding, he said, examining Clara's makeshift bandage. You might have saved his life. Together they got Charlie onto Rhett's horse, with Rhett holding him in place. Clara led both horses while Rhett supported the injured boy. Back at the ranch, they laid Charlie in Clara's bed, the cleanest in the house, while Miguel rode for the doctor. Clara made willow bark tea for the pain and kept cold compresses on Charlie's forehead. For hours she sat beside him, changing the compresses, getting him to sip water, monitoring his breathing. Rhett stayed too, pacing the small room. You should rest, Clara said during one of these circuits. I'll watch him. You're the one who ran all the way to the ranch and back, Rhett pointed out. You should rest. I'm fine. You're covered in dirt and sweat. Your hair's falling down and you're shaking. Clara looked down at herself. He was right. She was a mess, her Sunday dress filthy and torn, but she couldn't leave Charlie. I'm staying, she said firmly. Rhett studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Then I'm staying too. The doctor finally arrived near midnight. He examined Charlie, declared that Clara's quick thinking had likely prevented the worst outcome, and administered treatment. He'll need to stay here for a few days, Dr. Morrison announced. Keep the leg elevated and the wound clean. If fever doesn't set in by tomorrow night, he should make a full recovery. After the doctor left, Clara slumped in her chair, all the adrenaline draining away. Charlie was sleeping peacefully, his breathing steady. Come on, Rhett said softly. You need food and rest. I'll watch him. Too tired to argue, Clara followed him downstairs. He had set out bread and cheese and poured her a glass of water. You were remarkable today, he said as she ate. Most women would have panicked or fainted. You ran for help and kept your head. I did what needed to be done. It was more than that. Rhett leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. I misjudged you. When you first arrived in that fancy dress with your soft hands and Boston manners, I thought you'd last maybe a week. But you've worked harder than most ranch hands I've known. You've transformed this house, and today you probably saved that boy's life. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. I'm not looking for compliments, Mr. Callahan. I'm simply doing the job you're paying me for. It's more than the top. You care, he paused. And it's Rhett. I think we're past Mr. Callahan at this point. Rhett, then. They looked at each other across the kitchen, something shifting in the air between them. Claire was acutely aware of how late it was, how alone they were, how he was looking at her with those storm-gray eyes. I should go to bed, she said, standing quickly. I'll check on Charlie first. Clara, his voice stopped her at the door. Thank you for today, for everything. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and fled upstairs. Charlie Morrison stayed at the ranch for 5 days. His recovery is slow but steady under Clara's watchful care. She changed his bandages twice daily, made him nourishing broths, and kept him entertained with stories of Boston. When his father finally came to collect him, the elder Morrison shook Clara's hand with tears in his eyes. You saved my boy's life, he said gruffly. I won't forget that, Miss Whitmore. If you ever need anything, you just ask. Word of the incident spread through the territory like wildfire. Suddenly, Clara wasn't just that mail-order bride or Rhett Callahan's housekeeper. She was the Eastern woman who had saved Charlie Morrison from a rattlesnake, who had run 2 miles for help without hesitation. The shift in how people treated her was immediate. When she went to town the following Sunday, women who had previously offered only polite smiles now invited her to join their sewing circle. Mr. Jessup at the general store insisted on giving her a discount. Even rough cowboys tipped their hats and called her ma'am with genuine respect. But the most significant change was in Rhett. He began joining her on the porch after supper, sitting in the old rocking chair while she shelled peas or mended clothes. At first they sat in comfortable silence, but gradually they began to talk. "Tell me about Boston," he said one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. Clara's hands stilled on the shirt she was mending. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. What it was like growing up there. What you did with your biz, why you left." So she told him about the brownstone house with its gas lamps and indoor plumbing, about her father's shipping business and her mother's love of music, about debutante balls and afternoon teas and the rigid social rules that governed everything. "It sounds suffocating," Red observed. Sometimes it was. But there was beauty too. Symphony concerts, ice skating in winter, the smell of the sea. I took it all for granted until it was gone. "What happened to your father's business partner? The one who stole everything?" Clara's jaw tightened. "He disappeared, probably changed his name and started over somewhere new. Men like Charles Whitfield always land on their feet while the people they hurt suffer the consequences." "Your father trusted him?" "Completely. They'd been friends since boyhood. My father never saw it coming." She drove her needle through the fabric with more force than necessary. "I think that's what killed him. Not the financial ruin, but the betrayal." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "My father was Lakota, full blood. He worked as a scout for the cavalry before he met my mother. After she died, he tried to make a life with my mother's people, but neither world wanted him. Too Indian for the whites, too white for the tribes. He drank himself to death when I was 10. It was the most personal thing he had ever shared with her. Clara set down her mending and looked at him. In the fading light, his profile was sharp and beautiful. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "It was a long time ago. James's father took me in for a while, tried to civilize me, teach me to read and write, but his family back east never accepted it. When James came west, he asked me to help with the ranch. First time in my life, anyone from that side of the family treated me like I mattered. He must have trusted you very much to leave you the ranch." "He did, and I'm trying not to let him down, but it's harder than I expected." Rhett's hands tightened on the chair arms. "The mortgage payments are eating up everything. We had a hard winter, lost 40 head. Cattle prices are down. I'm doing everything I can, but sometimes I wonder if it's enough." Clara understood that fear intimately. "You'll find a way. You're too stubborn to fail." He laughed, genuine. "Is that your polite way of saying I'm difficult?" "I'm saying you don't give up. Neither do I. It's probably the only thing we have in common." "I don't know about that." His eyes met hers. "I think we might have more in common than you realize." The moment stretched between them, charged with something Clara couldn't quite name. Then Tommy's voice shattered it, calling from the barn about a mare that was foaling early. Rhett stood quickly. "I should go check on that." "Of course," he paused at the porch steps. "Clara, thank you for listening." "Any time." She watched him stride toward the barn, her heart beating faster than it should. This was dangerous. She was supposed to be saving money to leave, not developing feelings for her employer. But as she picked up her mending again, Clara couldn't quite suppress the smile that tugged at her lips. The following week brought new challenges. A summer storm rolled through, battering the ranch with wind and hail that damaged part of the barn roof. Then Jake took sick with a fever that laid him low for 3 days. Clara nursed him through it while trying to keep up with her regular duties. She was in the kitchen making bread when Rhett came in through the back door, his expression grim. "We've got trouble," he said without preamble. Clara wiped flour from her hands. "What kind of trouble?" "Railroad trouble. There's a man in the main room who wants to talk to me about buying land. Says he has documents proving James was negotiating to sell part of the ranch before he died." Her stomach dropped. Is that possible? I don't know. James never mentioned it. Will you sit in on the meeting? I could use another set of ears. Of course. The man in the main room was everything Rhett wasn't. Soft-handed, well-dressed, with slick confidence. He introduced himself as Albert Peaton, land agent for the Western Pacific Railroad. Mr. Callahan, thank you for seeing me. Peaton's smile didn't reach his eyes. Your late brother, James Harrison, was in negotiations with the railroad to sell a portion of this land for a new rail line. We have correspondence indicating he was quite amenable to the arrangement. What's this about documents? Red asked, remaining standing. Peaton pulled papers from his satchel. Unfortunately, his untimely death interrupted the proceedings. We're prepared to honor the original terms. $3,000 for a 100-acre strip along your eastern boundary. Rhett took the papers, his face unreadable. Clara watched his jaw tighten. These letters are dated from last year, he said finally, before James got sick. Indeed, the negotiations were well advanced. But there's no signed contract. Peaton's smile thinned. No, however, the railroad has already invested considerable resources based on his verbal agreement. We expect the arrangement to be honored. By who? Rhett's voice was dangerously quiet. James is dead. I inherited this ranch and I'm not interested in selling. Mr. Callahan, I don't think you understand. The railroad is coming through this territory whether you cooperate or not. We can either work together or we can explore other options. Legal options. Are you threatening me? I'm simply stating facts. The railroad has significant influence with the territorial government. Clara had been silent, but something in Peaton's tone made her speak up. May I see those letters? Both men looked at her as if they had forgotten she was there. I'm not sure what interest this would be to a lady, Peaton said condescendingly. Miss Whitmore is my business advisor, Rhett said smoothly, handing her the papers. Clara read quickly. The letters were indeed from James discussing selling land to the railroad. But they were exploratory, full of phrases like considering your proposal and would need to discuss terms further. These letters don't constitute an agreement, she said. They're preliminary discussions at best. There's no mention of specific acreage, no agreed price, and certainly no binding commitment. Peaton's eyes narrowed. The intent is clear. Intent isn't a contract, Mr. Peaton. If the railroad wants to purchase land from Mr. Callahan, you're welcome to make an offer. But you can't claim a binding agreement based on exploratory letters from a man who's been dead for months. Miss Whitmore, I don't think you understand how these matters work. I understand perfectly well. My father was a businessman. I grew up reviewing contracts and correspondence. These letters represent interest, nothing more. For a moment, Peaton looked like he had bitten into something sour. Then his expression smoothed. Very well, I can see this won't be resolved today. But this isn't over, Mr. Callahan. The railroad has resources you can't imagine. We get what we want, one way or another. After he left, Rhett sank into a chair. That was impressive. That was concerning, Clara reread the letters. He's right that the railroad has influence. If they want this land badly enough, they might find ways to pressure you. Let them try. I'm not selling. Even $3,000, Rhett, that would solve your mortgage problems. It would also cut a scar through my best grazing land. The railroad doesn't just take the strip they buy. They bring noise, sparks that start fires, scare the cattle. I've seen it happen. He stood and paced to the window. Besides, this ranch is all I have left of James. I made him a promise. Clara understood about promises to the dead. Then we need to be prepared for whatever Peaton tries next. We? You asked me to be your business advisor, didn't you? She smiled. Besides, I've dealt with men like Peaton before. They're all bluster until someone stands up to them. Rhett crossed the room and took her hands, an impulsive gesture that surprised them both. His palms were warm and calloused against hers. Thank you for backing me up, for understanding why this matters. Of course, Clara's voice came out softer than she intended. She was acutely aware of how close he was standing, how his gray eyes had darkened. He seemed to realize he was still holding her hands and released them quickly, stepping back. I should get back to work. After he left, Clara pressed her palms to her flushed cheeks. This was getting complicated. but she couldn't deny the warmth spreading through her chest or the way her skin still tingled where he had touched her. The trouble with Peyton and the railroad became the main topic of conversation over the next few days. Tommy reported seeing railroad surveyors on the eastern boundary. Miguel heard in town that Peyton was meeting with the territorial governor. Jake revealed that his father had lost his Texas ranch to railroad seizure under dubious circumstances. They said eminent domain, Jake told them over supper, claimed they needed the land for the public good, gave my father half what it was worth, and kicked us off within a month. He died 6 months later. Just gave up. The story cast a pall over the table. If the railroad could seize land in Texas, they could do it here too. We need to find out exactly what legal standing Peyton has, Clara said. Rhett, did James keep business records? There might be something that clarifies his intentions. There's a trunk in his old room full of papers. I haven't gone through it. Seemed like prying. I think circumstances have changed. May I look through it? Rhett nodded. Take whatever time you need. That night, after the supper dishes were washed, Clara went to James's room. The trunk sat at the foot of the bed. She opened it carefully, feeling like an intruder. Inside were stacks of papers, letters, ledgers, receipts, newspaper clippings. She settled on the floor and began sorting through them systematically. James Harrison had been meticulous in his record keeping. There were detailed accounts of ranch expenses, correspondence with cattle buyers, legal documents. And there, near the bottom, she found a leather portfolio labeled Railroad Correspondence. Inside were not just the letters Peyton had shown them, but several more. Clara read through them carefully. The early letters showed James's interest, but the later ones told a different story. One letter in particular made her breath catch. It was dated 2 weeks before James died, addressed to Peyton, but apparently never sent. Dear Mr. Peyton, it read, after careful consideration, I must withdraw from our discussions regarding the land sale. I've come to realize that the ranch is not mine alone to dispose of. It belongs to my brother Rhett as much as to me, perhaps more so. He has invested his labor and heart into this land, and I cannot in good conscience sell any portion without his full agreement. Furthermore, I am rewriting my will to ensure that upon my death, the ranch passes entirely to Rhett Callahan, who understands its value in ways I never will. Please consider this letter formal notice that I am declining your offer. Sincerely, James Harrison. Clara read it 3 times, her hands shaking. This changed everything. But why hadn't James sent it? She kept searching and found the answer. A draft of a new will dated the same day. In it, James left everything to Rhett with a personal note explaining his reasoning. Tears stung Clara's eyes. She had never met James Harrison, but she felt she understood him through these words. A man who had recognized his own limitations and tried to do right by his brother. Clara? She looked up to find Rhett in the doorway. I found something, she said, holding up the letter. You need to read this. He crossed the room and took the paper. She watched emotions play across his face, surprise, pain, something that might have been grief. He was going to refuse the railroad, he said quietly. He was going to leave me everything. According to this draft will, he did leave you everything. The question is whether he finalized it legally before he died. He must have. The lawyer in Cheyenne handled the estate. He told me James's will left me the ranch. Then this letter proves the railroad has no claim. James formally withdrew from negotiations before his death. Rhett looked at her, and in his eyes she saw vulnerability. Why didn't he tell me? About the railroad, about changing the will, about any of it? Maybe he was waiting for the right time. Or maybe he didn't want to burden you while he was still alive. Clara stood, brushing dust from her skirt. The important thing is that we have proof of his intentions. Peyton can't intimidate us now. This is the second time you've saved me, Rhett said. First with Charlie, now with this. I'm just doing what needs to be done. No, it's more than that. He stepped closer. You could have stayed in town, found some easy position. Instead, you came here and worked yourself raw. You saved a boy's life. You stood up to Peyton. You spent hours going through a dead man's papers. He paused. What? Clara's heart was pounding. Because this place matters. Because you matter. Because I can't seem to stop caring about the ranch, about the men, about you. Because, he prompted softly. Because, she whispered. Because I... She never got to finish. Rhett closed the distance between them and kissed her. It was nothing like the chaste kisses Clara had read about in novels. It was hungry and desperate and full of longing. His hands came up to cup her face, gentle despite the calluses, and she melted into him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Rhett rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that since the day you ran 2 miles to save Charlie Morrison, he admitted. Maybe before that. I thought you saw me as a burden. At first, maybe, but Clara, you're the strongest person I've ever met. You face down rattlesnakes and railroad agents without flinching. You make me believe that maybe I can save this ranch after all. She kissed him again, shorter but no less sweet. We'll save it together, partners. Partners, he agreed. They stood there for a long moment, holding each other in James's dusty room, surrounded by papers that proved what Red already knew, that this land was worth fighting for, and that he didn't have to fight alone. The next morning, Clara woke to find a wildflower on her pillow, a delicate purple bloom. She smiled and tucked it into her journal. Rhett was already in the kitchen, attempting coffee. He looked up when she entered, and the smile that crossed his face made her insides flutter. Morning, friend, he said. Good morning. What are you doing up so early? Couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about everything. The railroad, James, you. He abandoned the coffee pot and crossed to her, stealing a quick kiss. Mostly you. Rhett, the men, are out checking the north pasture. We have a few minutes. He kissed her again, longer this time. Clara laughed despite herself. I want to court you properly, he said, not hide how I feel. People will talk. Let them talk, I don't care. Before Clara could respond, they heard horses approaching. Rhett moved to the window and cursed softly. It's Piton, and he's brought the sheriff. Clara's stomach clenched. Already? Railroad money moves mountains, apparently. Rhett squared his shoulders. Stay here. I'll handle this. Oh, absolutely not. We're partners, remember? Besides, I have James's letter. They met Piton and Sheriff Dalton on the porch. The sheriff was an older man, and he looked uncomfortable. Mr. Callahan, the sheriff said, tipping his hat. Miss Whitmore, I apologize for the early intrusion. What's this about, Sheriff? Red asked. Piton smiled that oily smile. I've petitioned the territorial court regarding your late brother's agreement with the railroad. The judge has issued a temporary injunction freezing all business activities on this ranch until the matter can be resolved. On what grounds? Clara demanded. On the grounds that James Harrison entered into a binding verbal agreement and his heir is attempting to renege. The sheriff handed Red official-looking documents. This injunction prevents the sale of any cattle, prevents any modifications to the property. You must maintain the land in its current state until the court hearing. Red's face had gone dangerously still. When's the hearing? 3 weeks, in Cheyenne. We have evidence that James withdrew from those negotiations, Clara Boer said. A letter written weeks before his death, declining the railroad's offer. The court will review all evidence at the hearing, Piton said smoothly. Until then, this injunction stands. I trust you'll comply, Mr. Callahan. Violation could result in seizure of the property. After they left, Rhett stood staring at the papers, his jaw clenched. 3 weeks, he said finally. 3 weeks of not being able to sell cattle. The mortgage payment is due in 5 weeks. If I can't sell cattle, I can't make the payment. We'll fight this in court, Clara said firmly. We have James's letter. We have the will. We'll go to Cheyenne and prove Piton's lying. Against railroad lawyers? Clara, I can barely afford to keep this ranch running. With the truth, she grabbed his arm. We have the truth on our side. That has to count for something. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. When did you become such an optimist? I'm not optimistic. I'm stubborn. There's a difference. She squeezed his hand. Besides, I didn't come all the way to Wyoming to give up at the first sign of trouble. Despite everything, he laughed. God help the railroad then. The 3 weeks before the hearing passed in a blur of preparation and mounting tension. Clara spent her days poring over James's papers, organizing every scrap of evidence. At night, she lay awake worrying about what would happen if they lost. Rhett grew quieter as the days wore on, the weight of potential failure pressing down on him. He still came to the porch in the evenings, still stole kisses when the ranch hands weren't looking, but Clara could see the fear lurking behind his eyes. "I've been thinking," Clara said one evening, "we need a lawyer, someone who knows territorial law and can present our case properly. Lawyers cost money I don't have. What about the Morrison family? Charlie's father said if we ever needed anything, we should ask." Rhett was quiet, pride warring with practicality. "I don't like asking for help." "I know, but sometimes accepting help is the bravest thing you can do." He turned to look at her. "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise. You were just too stubborn to notice." That earned her a genuine smile. He pulled her close and they sat in silence as the sky turned from gold to purple. "I love you," Rhett said quietly. Clara's heart stuttered. They had kissed, held each other, talked about courting, but neither had spoken those words aloud. "You don't have to say it back," he continued. "I just wanted you to know. Whatever happens with the railroad, whatever comes next, I love you." Tears pricked Clara's eyes. "I love you too. I fought it for weeks, told myself this was temporary. But somewhere along the way, you became home." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. The next day, Rhett swallowed his pride and rode to the Morrison Ranch. He returned that evening with news that made Clara want to weep with relief. Not only had Charlie's father agreed to help, but he had already contacted a lawyer in Cheyenne, a man named Samuel Frost, who had successfully defended several ranchers against railroad claims. Morrison said Frost is expensive, but worth it, Rhett reported, and he's willing to loan me the money for legal fees, to be repaid once we can sell cattle again. That's wonderful. It's charity. It's not charity, it's a loan, and it's a father repaying a debt because you employed the woman who saved his son's life. Clara took his hand. "Let him help, Rhett. Pride is a luxury we can't afford right now." 2 days later, Samuel Frost arrived at the ranch. He was a thin, intense man in his 50s with sharp eyes. Clara liked him immediately. "Show me everything, Baton," he said, settling at the kitchen table. Every letter, every document, every scrap of paper related to James Harrison and the railroad. For hours, Clara and Rhett laid out their evidence while Frost took notes and asked pointed questions. When they showed him James's unsent letter declining the railroad's offer, his eyes gleamed. "This is excellent. Combined with the will naming you as sole heir, we have a strong case." "Strong enough to beat the railroad?" Rhett asked. Frost's expression grew serious. "The railroad will argue that verbal agreements are binding under territorial law. They'll bring in expert witnesses, probably bribe officials. They'll make this as difficult as possible." Clara's stomach sank. "So we might lose." "We might, but I've beaten railroad lawyers before." Frost gathered the papers. "The hearing is in 10 days. I'll need you both in Cheyenne 3 days early to prepare." After Frost left, Clara began making arrangements. Miguel would watch the ranch with Tommy and Jake. She packed their best clothes, made sure Rhett had a proper suit. The night before they were set to leave, Clara couldn't sleep. She heard footsteps in the hallway, then a soft knock at her door. "Clara, you awake?" She opened the door to find Rhett standing there, his hair mussed. "I couldn't sleep either," he said. "Can I come in?" It was improper, scandalous even. But Clara stepped aside and let him enter. They sat together on the edge of her bed, not touching, the space between them charged with unspoken fears. "What if we lose?" Rhett said quietly. "What if everything just disappears? Then we start over. We find another way." "There is no other way. This ranch is all I know. It's all I am." Clara took his hand. "That's not true. You're more than this land. You're kind and stubborn and brave. The ranch is part of you, but it's not all of you." He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "I'm scared." "I know. I'm scared too." She held him tighter. "But we face it together. That makes us stronger." They lay down together on top of the covers, fully clothed, holding each other in the darkness. Clara felt the steady rhythm of Rhett's breathing slow, felt his body relax into sleep. She stayed awake longer, memorizing the feel of him beside her. If this all fell apart, she wanted to remember this moment of peace. The journey to Cheyenne took 2 days by stagecoach. Clara and Rhett barely spoke, each lost in their own thoughts. Frost had arranged rooms at a respectable hotel. Separate rooms, of course, though the desk clerk's knowing look suggested he assumed otherwise. "You look exhausted," Frost said when they met him that evening. "Get a good night's sleep. We have a lot of work tomorrow." The next 3 days were grueling. Frost drilled them on their testimony, anticipating every question. He made Rhett practice explaining the ranch's operations until he could recite it in his sleep. He coached Clara on presenting James's letter. "The railroad will try to discredit both of you," Frost warned. "Mr. Callahan, they'll portray you as illegitimate with no legal claim. Miss Whitmore, they'll paint you as a scorned mail-order bride. You need to remain calm no matter what they say." Clara felt sick. She had known this would be difficult, but hearing it laid out so bluntly made her realize how ugly it could become. The night before the hearing, Rhett knocked on her hotel room door. When she opened it, he looked haggard. "I can't do this," he said. "Maybe I should just accept their offer and move on." Clara pulled him into her room. "You don't mean that, don't I? At least if I sell, I'd have enough to start fresh somewhere else. And give up everything James wanted for you? Everything you've worked for?" She gripped his arms. "Rhett Callahan, I know you're scared, but running away isn't going to make that fear disappear. We fight for what matters, even when it's hard. What if fighting isn't enough? Then at least we'll know we tried." He rested his forehead against hers. "How are you so strong?" "I'm not. I'm just too stubborn to quit." He kissed her then, desperate and hungry. Clara responded in kind, and somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice warned that this was improper. But the voice was drowned out by the thundering of her heart. They made love that night with fierce urgency, as if they could anchor themselves to each other and keep the uncertain future at bay. Afterward, they lay tangled together, and Rhett said quietly, "Marry me." Clara's breath caught. "What? Marry me, huh? I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build a life with you, whether it's on that ranch or somewhere else entirely. Marry me." Tears slid down Clara's cheeks. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." He kissed her softly, sealing the promise. They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, and for a few precious hours the world ceased to exist. The territorial courthouse was an imposing brick building that dominated the town square. Clara's hands were shaking as she and Rhett climbed the steps, Frost walking between them. Inside, the courtroom was half full with spectators. News of the hearing had spread, and it seemed like half of Cheyenne had turned out to watch the battle between a struggling rancher and the mighty railroad. Piton sat at one table with two lawyers in expensive suits. At the other table, Frost arranged his papers with methodical precision, while Clara and Rhett took their seats behind him. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Marcus Whitfield." Clara's heart stopped. Whitfield, that was the name of her father's business partner, the man who had stolen everything. It couldn't be the same man, but when the judge entered, Clara felt the blood drain from her face. It was him, older, with gray in his hair, but unmistakably Charles Whitfield, the man who had destroyed her father. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and she saw the flash of recognition in his face. For a moment he looked startled, almost afraid. Then his expression smoothed into professional neutrality. "Miss Whitmore." Frost was looking at her with concern. "Are you all right?" She couldn't speak. If she accused the judge of being a criminal, who would believe her? And making the accusation would derail the entire hearing. "I'm fine," she managed, "just nervous." Judge Whitfield called the proceedings to order. The railroad's lawyers presented their case first, painting James Harrison as a willing participant in negotiations who had been on the verge of signing a contract. When it was Frost's turn, he systematically dismantled their arguments. He pointed out that the letters showed only preliminary discussions. He produced James's unsent letter declining the offer, proving his client had withdrawn from negotiations. "The railroad is attempting to enforce an agreement that never existed," Frost argued. James Harrison explored their proposal and ultimately rejected it. Judge Whitfield listened with an impassive expression. When Frost finished, Whitfield leaned forward. "Mr. Frost, this unsigned letter is compelling, but how do we know it reflects Mr. Harrison's final wishes?" Your Honor, the letter is dated 2 weeks before Mr. Harrison's death. Additionally, on the same date, Mr. Harrison drafted a new will leaving everything to my client. The timing suggests a deliberate decision. The will was never properly executed, the railroad's lawyer interjected. It was, Frost countered, producing documentation. The will was witnessed and filed 3 days before his death. The court will hear testimony, Whitfield announced. Mr. Callahan, please take the stand. Rhett stood and walked to the witness chair. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Frost led him through his testimony, his relationship with James, his work on the ranch, his brother's final wishes. Rhett spoke clearly and honestly. Then the railroad's lawyer stood for cross-examination. Mr. Callahan, you claim to be James Harrison's brother, is that correct? Half-brother. We shared a father. A father who was married to your mother? No, my mother was Lakota. The marriage wasn't recognized by law. So you're illegitimate. Frost objected, but the damage was done. The spectators were whispering. The questioning went on, the lawyer trying to paint Rhett as an opportunist. But Rhett held firm, never losing his temper. When it was Clara's turn to testify, her legs felt like water. She carefully avoided looking at Whitfield as she swore her oath. Frost kept his questions simple. Clara answered clearly, focusing on the facts. Then the railroad's lawyer stood. Miss Whitmore, you were engaged to marry James Harrison, were you not? We had corresponded with that intention, yes. But he died before you could marry. That must have been quite disappointing. It was tragic. A kind man with property and money. Exactly what a penniless woman from Boston would want. Frost objected, but Whitfield overruled him. I won't deny I needed security, Clara said, lifting her chin. But I also hope to build a real partnership with James based on mutual respect. And yet here you are testifying on behalf of the man who inherited everything. Some might find that admirable, Clara shot back, that I'm helping to honor James's true wishes rather than pursuing my own interests. A few people in the gallery chuckled. Isn't it true that you and Mr. Callahan have become intimately involved? The lawyer asked. Heat flooded Clara's face. Mr. Callahan and I have developed feelings for each other, yes. But that doesn't change the facts regarding James's letter or his intentions. It suggests bias. Of course I have a personal stake, I love him. Clara looked directly at the jury, but that doesn't make the letter any less real or James's intentions any less clear. I found that letter because I spent hours trying to find the truth. And the truth is that James withdrew from negotiations and left everything to his brother. My feelings for Rhett don't change those facts. The lawyer tried a few more angles, but Clara held her ground. When she finally stepped down, her legs were shaking. The hearing continued for another hour with closing arguments. Finally, Judge Whitfield called for a recess while he considered the evidence. During the break, Clara found a quiet corner. She needed air, needed space to think. Miss Whitmore, she turned to find Whitfield standing nearby. Up close, she could see how much he had aged. Judge Whitfield, she said coldly, you recognize me. Of course I recognized you. You destroyed my father's life. Whitfield flinched. I wondered if you would be here when I saw the case involved a mail-order bride named Whitmore. He paused. Clara, I was desperate. I took your father's money thinking I could pay it back, but I couldn't, so I ran. You heard about my father's death and did nothing. I know, I have no excuse. He looked at her with desperation. But I can make one thing right. Your case against the railroad. I can rule it in your favor. Clara went very still. You're offering to throw the case? I'm offering justice. The railroad's claim is weak. You have clear evidence. I would simply be ensuring the right outcome. And coincidentally assuaging your guilt. Perhaps. Would that be so wrong? Clara looked at him for a long moment. I don't want your guilt. I want you to judge this case fairly based on the evidence. Can you do that? Whitfield looked surprised. You've grown into a remarkable woman. Your father would be proud. Don't talk about my father. Just answer my question. Yes, I can judge fairly. I will judge fairly. He hesitated. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Clara turned away. We'll see what your ruling says about your regrets. When court reconvened, Judge Whitfield took his seat, his expression grave. I've reviewed the evidence and testimony, he began. This case hinges on whether James Harrison entered into a binding verbal agreement with the railroad. He paused, and the silence was absolute. The railroad has presented letters showing preliminary negotiations. However, the defense has presented compelling evidence that Mr. Harrison withdrew from these negotiations prior to his death. The letter declining the railroad's offer, while unsent, clearly demonstrates his intent. The timing, coinciding with a new will leaving all property to his brother, suggests a deliberate decision. Clara could barely breathe. Therefore, Whitfield continued, I am ruling in favor of the defendant, Rhett Callahan. The injunction is lifted immediately. The ranch property remains under Mr. Callahan's sole ownership, free from any claim by the Western Pacific Railroad. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered, others protested. Frost was smiling broadly, and Rhett pulled Clara into his arms. We won, he said against her hair. Clara, we won. She was crying and laughing at the same time, relief flooding through her. Outside the courthouse, Frost congratulated them. You both did well. The ranch is secure. Thanks to you, Rhett said. Actually, Morrison already settled my fee. He said to consider it a gift. After Frost left, Clara and Rhett stood on the courthouse steps, the afternoon sun warm on their faces. I can't believe it's over, Clara said. It's not over. It's just beginning. Rhett took her hand. We still have a ranch to run and a wedding to plan. Clara laughed. In that order? Definitely not. Wedding first. I'm not risking you changing your mind. I'm not going to change my mind. He kissed her right there on the courthouse steps in full view of anyone who cared to watch, and Clara kissed him back. They had won. They had fought the railroad and won. The ranch was safe. Their future was secure. The journey back to the ranch took on a completely different character than the tense trip to Cheyenne. Clara and Rhett sat close together in the stagecoach, fingers intertwined, occasionally breaking into smiles for no reason other than sheer relief. When's the wedding? The merchant's wife, who shared their coach, asked after they explained their good news. Clara and Rhett looked at each other, realizing they hadn't discussed details. Soon, they said simultaneously, then laughed. But as the miles passed, Clara's practical nature reasserted itself. Winning the court case was only the first step. They still had a ranch to save. Rhett, she said quietly, the mortgage payment. When is it due? His expression sobered. 2 weeks. I need to sell at least 80 head to cover it. Can we do that in 2 weeks? With everything that's happened, we've lost time, but we'll do it. His jaw set with determination. Now that the injunction is lifted, I can move the cattle to market. Miguel and Tommy can handle the drive to Cheyenne. It'll be tight, but we'll make it. When they finally arrived back at Callahan Ranch 2 days later, Miguel, Tommy, and Jake came rushing out to meet them. The relief on their faces was palpable. Thank God, Miguel said, helping Clara down. We heard rumors in town that the railroad won. We won, Clara said. The injunction is lifted. How are things here? Rhett asked. Any problems? Nothing we couldn't handle, Jake said, though we're nearly out of flour and coffee. We'll get to all of it, Rhett said. But first things first, boys. We need to get 80 head ready for market. We're driving them to Cheyenne in 3 days. The ranch hands exchanged glances. Tommy spoke up hesitantly. Boss, that's a 2-day drive each way, plus time to sell. We'd need to leave most of the herd here with just one person watching. I'll watch the herd, Clara said. All 4 men turned to stare at her. Clara, it's not just riding, Rhett said carefully. It's knowing what to look for. Sick animals, broken fences, predators. Then teach me. We don't have time to hire extra hands, and we can't risk the mortgage payment. Miguel grinned. I like her, boss. She's tougher than half the cowboys I've known. Over Rhett's protests, it was decided. For the next 3 days, while Rhett and the hands prepared the cattle for market, Jake stayed behind to teach Clara the basics of herd management. He was patient and thorough, showing her how to spot signs of illness, how to repair simple fence breaks, how to watch for predators. Wolves usually hunt at dawn or dusk, he explained. You'll hear the cattle get restless. If that happens, fire a couple shots in the air. That usually scares them off. Clara nodded, trying to absorb everything. Why do you stay? She asked Jake as they paused by a creek. You could work anywhere. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Rhett gave me a job when no one else would. Didn't ask questions about my past, just said, Can you work hard? And when I said yes, that was enough. He glanced at her. Some men judge you on where you've been. Rhett judges you on who you are now. That's rare. Clara understood. Wasn't that exactly what Rhett had done for her? The night before the cattle drive, Clara made a special supper. Fried chicken, biscuits, gravy, and apple pie. The men ate with appreciation. After supper, Rhett found Clara on the porch, staring out at the darkening prairie. You don't have to do this, he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. We could hire someone from town. With what money? Every dollar counts. She turned in his arms. I can do this, Rhett. I need to do this. The ranch has to be ours together. You've never been a decoration. He kissed her forehead. You're the strongest person I know. He pulled a small box from his pocket. I have something for you. Inside was a simple gold band. I bought it in Cheyenne before we even won the court case, he admitted. I believed we'd need it eventually. When I get back, he said, slipping it on her finger, we're getting married. I don't care if it's just us and the circuit preacher. I'm not waiting any longer. Clara smiled. Agreed, though I'd like to at least wear a clean dress. You could wear a flour sack, and you'd still be the most beautiful bride in the territory. They stood on that porch watching the sun set, and Clara felt profound peace settle over her. This was exactly where she was meant to be. The cattle drive left at dawn. Clara stood watching the small herd move out, Rhett and Miguel riding point while Tommy brought up the rear. Then they were gone, and Clara was alone. The ranch felt different without the men. Quieter, emptier. Clara threw herself into work to combat the loneliness. She cleaned, baked, organized. And twice a day, morning and evening, she saddled the horse and rode out to check the herd. It was harder than Jake had made it look. The first morning, she couldn't find a section of the herd and spent 2 hours in growing panic before discovering they had simply moved to a different grazing area. By the third day, Clara felt like she was getting the hang of it. She rose before dawn, made her rounds efficiently, handled small problems as they arose. On the fourth evening, as Clara was finishing her rounds, she noticed the cattle acting strangely. They were bunched together tightly, their heads up, ears pricked forward. Then she saw them. 4 wolves along the tree line, their gray coats blending with shadows. They were watching the herd with hungry eyes. Clara's hand went to the rifle in her saddle scabbard. She had practiced shooting with Jake, but she had never shot at anything living. Her hands were shaking as she pulled the rifle free. The wolves began to circle, moving with coordinated precision. They were after one of the calves. Clara fired a warning shot into the air. The sound cracked across the prairie. The wolves paused, yellow eyes fixing on her. She fired again and again, spacing her shots. The wolves broke and ran, disappearing into the trees. Clara sat on her horse, breathing hard, the rifle still clutched in her shaking hands. She had done it. She had protected the herd, but her triumph was short-lived. As she was riding back in the gathering darkness, her horse stepped in a gopher hole. The animal stumbled badly, nearly throwing Clara from the saddle. When she dismounted to check, her heart sank. The horse was favoring its front left leg, clearly in pain. She couldn't ride him back. She would have to walk, leading the injured horse. The barn was at least 2 miles away. Clara set off on foot, talking soothingly to the horse as they limped along together. The prairie at night was full of sounds she couldn't identify. Every crack of a twig made her jump. But Clara kept walking, one step at a time, keeping her eyes on the dark shape of the barn in the distance. When she finally reached the barn, her legs were shaking. She got the horse settled, checked his injury, a bad strain but nothing broken, and stumbled to the house. It was nearly midnight. Clara collapsed on her bed and fell asleep immediately. The next morning, she woke to pounding on the door. Disoriented, Clara stumbled downstairs to find Mrs. Price on the porch with a basket. "Good heavens, child, you look like death," Mrs. Price said, pushing past Clara. "When I heard the men had gone to market and left you here alone, I thought I'd better check on you." "I'm fine," Clara protested, though she probably didn't look it. "Just tired." Despite Clara's protest, Mrs. Price stayed the entire day. She tended to the injured horse, made Clara a hot bath, and cooked a decent meal. More importantly, she provided company. "You're the talk of Cheyenne," Mrs. Price said. "A refined Boston lady going up against railroad lawyers and winning. Half the territory thinks you're some kind of hero. What do you think? Claire asked. Mrs. Price smiled. I think you found where you belong. Not everyone does. You're lucky. The cattle drive returned on the sixth day. Clara heard them before she saw them. The lowing of cattle, the jingle of spurs, the voices of the men. She ran out to meet them. Rhett dismounted and pulled Clara into his arms, kissing her right there in front of everyone. Did you miss me? He asked, grinning. Terribly. How did it go? His grin widened. Better than good. Prices were up. I got nearly $40 ahead. We made more than enough for the mortgage payment and then some. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Really? We're going to be all right? We're going to be more than all right. He kissed her again. We're going to be fine. That night, after the celebration supper Clara had prepared, after the ranch hands had retired, Clara and Rhett sat at the kitchen table going over the accounts. With what we made, we can pay the mortgage and have about $300 left, Rhett said. That's the healthiest the ranch finances have been in over a year. Clara studied the ledger. What if we went to the bank first, before anyone else can interfere? Show them we won the court case, that we have the money, that the ranch is viable. That's a good idea. Rhett pulled her to her feet and into his arms. Marry me tomorrow. What? Tomorrow. I want you as my wife legally and officially. I want us facing whatever comes next as partners in every possible way. Clara's heart raced. Tomorrow, Rhett, I don't even have a proper dress. I don't care what you wear. Just marry me. She looked into his eyes and saw the love and determination there. Yes, tomorrow. But I'm wearing my blue silk dress. It's been sitting in my trunk all this time. I might as well get some use out of it. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Clara woke early and retrieved the blue silk dress from her trunk. It smelled of cedar and memories. She dressed carefully, fixing her hair in a simple style. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Sun-bronzed skin, hands that showed evidence of hard work, eyes that held confidence instead of desperation. Downstairs, Rhett was pacing in his best suit. Miguel, Tommy, and Jake were dressed in their cleanest shirts, looking excited and uncomfortable. You look beautiful, Rhett said when Clara appeared. They rode to town in the wagon, all five of them crowded together, laughing. Mrs. Price had arranged for the circuit preacher to meet them at the small church. When they arrived, Clara was surprised to find a small crowd gathered. Mrs. Price, Mr. Jessup, the Morrison family, including young Charlie, and several other townspeople. Word travels fast, Mrs. Price said with a wink. The ceremony was simple. The preacher asked the traditional questions. Rhett and Clara gave the traditional answers. When Rhett slipped the gold band on her finger, Clara felt the weight of the promise settle over her. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the preacher declared. You may kiss your bride. And Rhett did, thoroughly, while the crowd cheered. Mrs. Clara Callahan. The name felt right in a way Miss Clara Whitmore never had. After the wedding reception at the boarding house, Clara and Rhett returned to the ranch, still dressed in their wedding finery. Clara's head rested on Rhett's shoulder as the wagon bounced over the familiar trail. Mrs. Callahan, Rhett said, testing the name. I like the sound of that. So do I, Clara smiled. Though I'm still going to give you a hard time when you track mud through my clean kitchen. Your clean kitchen? I seem to remember it being my kitchen first. Our kitchen, our ranch, our future. She sat up to look at him. We're in this together now. The ranch hands had tactfully decided to sleep in the barn that night. Clara and Rhett made love in their bedroom, slowly and tenderly, sealing their marriage with whispered promises. Afterward, as Clara lay in Rhett's arms, she thought about the long journey that had brought her here. From Boston to Broken Creek to this bed in Wyoming territory. She had come west expecting one life and found something completely different. Something harder, rawer, more honest. Something real. What are you thinking about? Rhett murmured. About how sometimes the best things in life are the ones we never plan for. She tilted her head up to kiss his jaw. I was supposed to marry a refined banker. Instead, I married a stubborn cowboy, and I've never been happier. Stubborn, but he was smiling. I prefer to think of it as determined. Stubborn, Clara repeated firmly. The morning after their wedding, they rode to Cheyenne to make the final mortgage payment. They walked into Mr. Garrison's office together, with Rhett carrying the bank draft proudly. Mr. and Mrs. Callahan, Garrison greeted them, his eyes falling on Clara's wedding ring. Congratulations. And what brings you here today? We're here to make our mortgage payment, Clara said. Garrison processed the payment, then handed Rhett a stamped receipt. Your account is current. Well done, Mr. Callahan. Walking out of the bank felt like flying. Clara watched Rhett's face as he stared at the receipt. We did it, he said. We're caught up. For the first time since James died, we're not behind. They celebrated that night with a special dinner. Eleanor slept peacefully in Clara's arms while they toasted their success. The summer was glorious. Clara planted a garden that flourished. Rhett and the hands worked on improvements. A new barn roof, expanded corral, repairs to the bunkhouse. The ranch was thriving. One evening in late June, as Clara sat on the porch watching Rhett work with a young horse, she realized she had been in Wyoming for exactly 1 year. 12 months since she stepped off that stagecoach expecting to marry James Harrison. So much had changed. She had gone from a desperate mail-order bride to a confident ranch wife. From someone with soft hands and impractical dreams to someone who could birth a calf, fix a fence, and shoot a rifle. From someone looking for security to someone who had built it with her own hands. What are you thinking about? Red asked, joining her. About how different my life is from what I expected. About how grateful I am. Grateful that James died? Rhett looked shocked. I know that sounds terrible. I'm sorry James died young. He was a good man. But if he'd lived, I would have married him, and I never would have fallen in love with you. Never would have discovered I could be strong. She reached for his hand. Sometimes the worst things that happen lead to the best things. Rhett pulled her close. I love you, Clara Callahan. You're the bravest, strongest, most amazing woman I've ever known. In September, Mrs. Price arrived with news during one of her visits. She took one look at Clara and smiled knowingly. When are you going to tell Rhett? She asked. Clara blinked. Tell him what? That you're expecting, dear. I've raised 6 children. I know the signs. Heat flooded Clara's face. She had suspected for a few weeks but had been waiting to be certain. How did you know? The way you've been looking peaked in the mornings. Little things. Mrs. Price smiled warmly. Have you seen a doctor? Not yet. I wanted to be sure, for I worried Rhett. That man worships the ground you walk on. This news will make him the happiest man in Wyoming. That evening, Clara found Rhett in the barn checking on a pregnant mare. How's she doing? Clara asked. Should foal any day now. He straightened. Everything all right? You look like you have something on your mind. I do, actually. Clara took a deep breath. I'm pregnant. Rhett froze, his eyes going wide. You're certain? As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor, Mrs. Price guessed this afternoon. For a moment, he just stared at her. Then a smile spread across his face. So wide and genuine it transformed him. He crossed to her and lifted her off her feet, spinning her around. We're having a baby, he said, laughing. Clara, we're having a baby. He set her down gently, then cupped her face in his hands. I love you. God, I love you so much. You've given me everything. A home, a future, and now a child. We're both lucky, Clara said, tears streaming down her face. We found each other when we both needed saving. He kissed her then, soft and reverent, his hand drifting down to rest on her stomach. I promise I'll take care of you. Both of you. The winter came early that year. Clara's pregnancy progressed smoothly, though she had to gradually give up some of her more strenuous chores. Rhett hovered anxiously. I'm pregnant, not made of glass, Clara protested when he objected to her carrying laundry. Not my woman carrying my baby, he countered, taking the basket. The ranch hands were equally solicitous. Tommy brought her wildflowers even in winter. Jake carved a beautiful cradle from oak wood. Miguel rode to town every week, checking if Clara needed anything. You're all going to spoil this baby rotten, Clara said, laughing. That's the plan, Miguel grinned. In December, a letter arrived from Margaret in Boston, apologizing for abandoning Clara and asking forgiveness. Clara wrote back, telling her about the ranch, about Rhett, about the baby coming in spring. She didn't sugarcoat it, but she made clear she had found something in the West that Boston never could have given her. Christmas came, and Clara insisted on celebrating properly despite being 7 months pregnant. She made a feast that made the ranch hands groan with pleasure. "This is the best Christmas I've ever had," Tommy said, his eyes bright. "Well, you're family now," Clara said firmly. "All of you." After supper, Rhett gave Clara a beautiful hand-tooled leather journal. "For writing down the baby's milestones," he explained. "I was thinking about names," he said, looking almost shy. "If it's a boy, maybe James. After my brother." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "James Callahan. I love it. And if it's a girl, what about Eleanor? After Mrs. Price." Rhett smiled. "Eleanor Callahan. Perfect." The new year brought deeper snow and brutal cold. Clara spent more time indoors, preparing for the baby's arrival by sewing tiny clothes and organizing the nursery corner where Jake's cradle sat waiting. On a stormy night in late February, Clara's labor began. Rhett rode through blinding snow to fetch Mrs. Price and the doctor. By the time they returned, Clara's contractions were coming hard and fast. The labor lasted through the night and into the next day. Rhett paced outside the bedroom door, listening to Clara's cries with helpless anguish. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, he heard a different sound, the thin, outraged wail of a newborn baby. Mrs. Price opened the door, beaming. "You have a daughter, Rhett, a beautiful, healthy daughter." And Clara came through like a champion. He pushed past her into the room. Clara lay propped against pillows, exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle. "Meet Eleanor James Callahan," she whispered. "I decided she should have both names." Rhett crossed to the bed and looked down at his daughter for the first time. She was red-faced and wrinkled with a shock of dark hair. She was the most perfect thing he had ever seen. "Can I hold her?" he asked, his voice rough. Clara transferred the baby into his arms. Eleanor squirmed and made small mewing sounds. Rhett felt something in his chest crack open, a flood of love so intense it was almost painful. "Hello, little one," he murmured. "Welcome to Callahan Ranch." As winter gave way to spring, the ranch came alive again. The snow melted, revealing new grass that turned the valley emerald green. And Eleanor grew, transforming from a red-faced newborn into a chubby, happy baby who smiled at everyone. Clara spent her days balancing motherhood with ranch management. She would nurse Eleanor, then strap the baby to her chest in a carrier and go about her chores. She had learned to cook one-handed, clean with a baby on her hip, and even ride slowly around the property with Eleanor secured in front of her. "You're the most unconventional mother I've ever met," Mrs. Price said during one visit. "But I think you are also one of the best." "I'm just doing what needs to be done," Clara said. But she smiled, proud of the life she had built. In May, Rhett made a decision that would change everything. He came to Clara one evening with the account books. "I've been thinking," he said. "With 2 good years behind us, with the ranch stable, I want to pay off the entire mortgage. No more monthly payments. No more worrying about the bank. Just us and our land, free and clear." Clara's eyes widened. "Can we afford it?" "Just barely. Between cattle sales and some horse trading, we've saved enough. It means we won't have much cushion, but Clara, I want this ranch to be truly ours. I want Eleanor to grow up knowing this land belongs to her family with no strings attached." Clara thought about it for only a moment. "Let's do it." 2 weeks later, they rode to Cheyenne together, with Eleanor sleeping peacefully in Clara's arms. They walked into Mr. Garrison's office as a family. "Mr. and Mrs. Callahan," Garrison greeted them. Then his eyes fell on Eleanor. "And this must be the newest Callahan. Congratulations." "Thank you," Clara said. "We're here to pay off our mortgage, the entire remaining balance." Garrison's eyebrows rose. "The full amount? That's quite an accomplishment." Rhett handed over the bank draft. "The ranch has had 2 good years. We've managed to save enough to clear the debt." Garrison processed the payment, then handed Rhett the deed to the property, now stamped paid in full. "Congratulations. The ranch is entirely yours now, free and clear of any liens. You've done very well." Walking out of that bank holding the deed felt like the culmination of everything they had fought for. Clara clutched Eleanor close, watching Rhett's face as he stared at the document. "It's really ours," he said, wonder in his voice. "No more mortgage, no more worrying, just ours." "Just ours," Clara confirmed, tears in her eyes. "We did it, Rhett. We really did it." They celebrated that night at Cheyenne's finest restaurant, Eleanor sleeping peacefully, while they toasted their success. To the ranch, to the future, to the family they had built from nothing but love and determination. The summer was perhaps the most glorious Clara had ever experienced. The garden flourished beyond her expectations. The cattle herd grew strong and healthy. Tommy announced his engagement to a girl from town, and Clara helped plan the wedding. Jake finally opened up about his past, finding healing in their community. Miguel took over more of the horse training, discovering real talent. One evening in late August, Clara sat on the porch with Eleanor while Rhett worked with a particularly spirited mare in the corral. She watched him move with easy confidence, and her heart swelled with love and pride. This man who had seemed so harsh and intimidating when she first stepped off that stagecoach was now her husband, her partner, the father of her child. This ranch that had looked so lonely and neglected was now a thriving home. These men who had been strangers were now family. "What are you smiling about?" Red asked, joining her on the porch after finishing with the horse. "Everything," Clara said simply. "I'm smiling about everything." He sat beside her, and together they watched the sun set over their land. Eleanor babbled contentedly between them, reaching for her father's face with chubby fingers. "Do you ever miss Boston?" Red asked. Clara considered the question honestly. "Sometimes I miss certain things. Music, libraries, the ocean. But miss living there? No, that wasn't really living. That was existing, following rules, trying to be what other people expected." She leaned into him. "This is living. Hard work, honest sweat, building something real with my own hands. This is home. Even though it didn't turn out like you planned. Especially because it didn't turn out like I planned." Clara turned to look at him. "I came here expecting a refined gentleman banker who would provide security and comfort. Instead, I got a rugged cowboy who challenged me to be stronger than I ever knew I could be. I got a ranch that demanded everything I had and gave back more than I dreamed possible. I got a family, both the one I created and the one I found." She touched his face gently. "Sometimes the best things in life are the ones we never plan for. Sometimes we need to lose everything to find what really matters." Rhett pulled her close, careful not to jostle Eleanor. "I used to think this ranch was all I needed, just me and the land and honest work. I thought I was complete." He kissed the top of her head. "I was wrong. I needed you. I needed this. Partners and love and family. You made me complete, Clara." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Clara felt profound gratitude wash over her. She had come to Wyoming territory as a desperate mail-order bride, with nothing but a trunk full of impractical dresses and fading hopes. She had expected to marry a gentleman and live a comfortable, predictable life. Instead, she had married a cowboy, and she had found herself. Years later, when Eleanor and baby James, born the following November, were old enough to ask about how their parents met, Clara would tell them the whole story. About the mail-order bride who traveled west, expecting one man and found another. About the cowboy who initially saw her as a burden and learned to see her as a partner. About the ranch they nearly lost and then fought to keep. About the railroad and the court case and all the obstacles they overcame together. "So Daddy wasn't what you expected?" Eleanor would ask, her gray eyes so like her father's, wide with curiosity. "No," Clara would answer honestly. "He was better. Everything was better than I expected because it was real. Your father and I built a life based on truth and hard work and love. That's stronger than any fantasy." And every evening when the work was done and the children were tucked into bed, Clara and Rhett would sit together on that porch where they had first started having real conversations. They would watch the sun set over the golden Wyoming plains, over the ranch they had named Callahan Ridge, and they would remember how far they had come. From two broken people with nothing to lose to a family with everything to fight for. From employer and employee to partners in every sense of the word. From strangers to soulmates. The mail-order bride had expected a gentleman. Instead, she had gotten a rugged cowboy who became her home, her partner, and her great love. And that, Clara knew, was exactly what she had needed all along. Clara stood at the window of the ranch house she had scrubbed clean with her own hands, watching her husband teach their daughter to ride. Eleanor, now 3 years old, sat in front of Red on his horse, her delighted squeals carrying across the valley. Baby James napped peacefully in the cradle Jake had carved, and another baby grew in Clara's belly, due in the spring. The ranch thrived. The mortgage was paid. The cattle herd was the largest it had ever been. Tommy had married and brought his bride to live in the newly built cabin on the eastern pasture. Miguel had purchased land of his own nearby, though he still worked Callahan Ranch 3 days a week. Jake had finally made peace with his past and written to his sister in Texas. Clara's hands rested on her swelling stomach, no longer soft but strong and capable. Hands that could deliver a calf, shoot a rifle, knead bread, and rock a baby to sleep. Hands that had built a life. She had come to Wyoming expecting to be saved. Instead, and she had learned to save herself. She had discovered that real strength came not from having everything, but from losing everything and choosing to build again. That true partnership meant fighting side by side, not one person protecting the other. That home wasn't a place or a person, but a choice you made every single day. The mail-order bride who stepped off that stagecoach in Broken Creek was gone. In her place stood Clara Callahan, ranch wife, mother, partner, and the strongest version of herself she had ever been. And as Rhett rode back toward the house with Eleanor still chattering excitedly, as he dismounted and swept Clara into his arms for a kiss that still made her heart race after all this time, she knew with absolute certainty that this life, this man, this ranch, was everything she had never known she wanted. Sometimes the wrong train takes you to the right destination. Sometimes losing everything means finding what truly matters. Sometimes the rugged cowboy is exactly what the refined lady needs. And sometimes, just sometimes, the best love stories are the ones we never see coming.